The clock ticked louder in the silence of the dining room than the clink of cutlery on porcelain. Sophia sat across from Daniel, her fork pushing half-wilted arugula around her plate untouched. He scrolled through his phone, eyes fixed on a glowing screen, occasionally murmuring a response to an email. It was a scene that had repeated itself for months, routine, predictable, painfully quiet. "Long day?" she asked, her voice soft but deliberate. He muttered, not looking up. "Just swamped. The Thompson account is bleeding hours." Sophia nodded, pretending to understand. She had stopped asking for details months ago. Even the language of his world now felt foreign to her. Deadlines, investors, mergers. Once, he used to share it all, with excitement dancing in his voice. Now, she was just a background presence, someone to acknowledge but no longer engage. She studied his face, handsome still, but hardened, like a sculpture weathered by time. There were shadows under his eyes, but not from worry over their marriage. Daniel's concerns were tethered to spreadsheets and presentations, not the silence growing between them. After dinner, he disappeared into his study. She stood by the doorway for a moment, watching him through the crack. His shoulders were hunched over his laptop, lips moving slightly as he rehearsed a pitch. She wanted to step in, place a hand on his back and whisper, "I miss you." But what good would it do? Instead, she climbed the stairs alone. Their bedroom was immaculate, clean lines, pale linens, untouched softness. It looked more like a showroom than a shared space of intimacy. She slid into bed, the sheets cool and unfamiliar, and stared at the ceiling until her eyes blurred. Her body ached, not from desire, but from neglect. The kind of ache that doesn't scream, it simmers. Quietly, patiently. The next morning, Daniel was gone before sunrise. A sticky note on the kitchen counter read, "Early meeting. Left coffee in the pot." It was always the small gestures that stung the most, evidence of duty, not affection. Later that afternoon, Sophia met Lena at a local cafe. Her best friend of 10 years, Lena had a sharp tongue wrapped in kindness. She saw through things most people missed. "You look exhausted," Lena said, stirring her chai latte. Or maybe just emotionally starved. Sophia smiled weakly. "Is it that obvious?" Lena tilted her head. "Only to someone who's been there. You don't talk about Daniel anymore. When did you two last have a real conversation?" Sophia exhaled slowly. "I don't even remember. It's like we coexist. We share space, not life." Lena leaned forward. "Then what are you still holding on to?" The question lingered longer than it should have. Sophia wanted to say love, but the word felt dishonest now. Was it love or habit? Memory? Obligation? That evening, Sophia attended a charity fundraiser, a last-minute invitation from a colleague she barely knew. She almost declined, but something about escaping the silence of home felt necessary. The venue buzzed with soft jazz and laughter. Strangers mingled beneath chandeliers, sipping wine and exchanging polished conversations. She wandered toward the art exhibit, a quieter corner where she could be alone with her thoughts. That's where she met Marcus. He stood beside a large abstract painting, arms crossed, his gaze thoughtful. When their eyes met, he smiled. Not the practiced kind, but the genuine sort that softens a face. "Interesting piece," he said. "Feels like it's saying something, without actually speaking." Sophia chuckled. "A bit like most people in this room." He laughed, a warm, full sound. "I'm Marcus." "Sophia." They shook hands. His grip was firm, but not imposing. There was a gentleness to his presence, a calm that contrasted the noise of the event. For the next hour, they spoke effortlessly about art, travel, music, and the quiet ache of feeling alone in a crowded room. He listened, not just with his ears, but with his eyes, his posture, his silence. Sophia found herself smiling more in that hour than she had in weeks. As she prepared to leave, Marcus touched her arm lightly. "It was really nice talking to you. I hope we bump into each other again." She nodded, heart fluttering in a way she didn't expect. "Me too." On her way home, she couldn't shake the feeling. A strange warmth lingered. Not desire exactly, but awareness. A shift.
A spark.
She didn't know what it meant yet, but something had undeniably begun. Sophia hadn't expected to see Marcus again. That brief conversation at the fundraiser had felt like a fleeting moment, a passing warmth in a life grown cold. But 3 days later, she spotted him at the same cafe she often visited with her laptop, trying to write, read, or simply exist outside the confines of her silent home. He noticed her before she had the chance to decide whether to wave or retreat. "Sophia," he said, his smile just as disarming as she remembered. "You again." "Looks like we have similar taste in hiding places," she replied, masking the small jolt in her chest. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Join me, if you're not in a rush." She hesitated, then sat down.
It was just coffee.
Just conversation.
Just company.
Nothing more. But every word between them seemed to echo a deeper resonance than anything she had heard in months. Marcus had a way of speaking that made everything feel significant, like even idle talk carried meaning. He wasn't loud or flashy. He simply paid attention, and in doing so, made her feel visible again. They met again the following week, this time, not by coincidence. He messaged her on social media with a simple, "Are you planning to visit your favorite cafe this Friday? I might need a distraction from work." Sophia told herself it was innocent, friendly, still within bounds. Their third meeting blurred those boundaries. It was raining. She arrived drenched, her coat clinging to her skin. Marcus stood as she walked in, concern in his eyes. "You're soaked. Sit. Let me get you a towel from the bar." She laughed, shaking droplets from her hair. "I look like a stray dog." "You look beautiful," he said, not missing a beat. The words weren't lewd. They weren't layered with ulterior motive. But they hit her like a sudden gust of warmth. Unexpected, intimate, dangerous. Later, as they sipped warm tea, their conversation drifted into more personal waters. "Are you happy, Sophia?" Marcus asked, his voice low. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years, not even herself. "I don't know," she admitted. He didn't push. He just listened. And Sophia began to talk, truly talk. About Daniel, about the growing silence, the fading touch, the nights she spent pretending she didn't feel invisible. She didn't realize how much she'd said until her voice began to crack. Marcus reached across the table, fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief but grounding. He didn't try to fix her. He just sat there, present, real. After that day, their interactions became more frequent. A coffee here, a text there, messages late at night when sleep refused to come. There was no official line crossed, but something had already shifted. One evening, while Daniel worked late again, Sophia lay in bed scrolling through old photos, vacations, anniversaries, birthdays. She paused on an image of her and Daniel in Paris, arms wrapped around each other, laughing into the camera. She couldn't remember what they'd laughed about. She couldn't remember if it was real. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus. I was just thinking about you. How are you tonight?" Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed, erased, typed again. "Sophia. Lonely. But I guess that's normal now." He responded immediately. "Marcus, you deserve better than lonely." She stared at the screen, heart pounding. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, how he made her feel like her silence mattered, like her sadness had weight. Sophia closed her eyes and remembered Daniel, how he used to kiss her shoulders in the morning, how he used to say, "You're my favorite distraction." Now, she barely felt like a footnote in his life. The next time she met Marcus, it wasn't at the cafe. He invited her to a quiet art exhibit downtown, a private showing. It wasn't romantic, not overtly, but the intimacy of it was undeniable. The gallery was hushed, candlelit, paintings suspended in silence. Marcus stood beside her, his voice a whisper. Some pieces speak more in their stillness than in color. Sophia turned toward him. "Do you see me as a painting too, Marcus?" He looked at her, eyes soft.
"No."
"I see you as a story, one I'd read again and again." The moment lingered, heavy and delicate. Sophia felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. They hadn't touched, really touched, but something inside her already had. And she knew, even if she tried to pretend otherwise, she was no longer just slipping. She was falling. The night air was unusually warm, brushing against Sophia's skin as she stepped out of the car. The gallery evening with Marcus had lingered in her mind like a fragrance, intoxicating and impossible to forget. She hadn't planned to meet him again so soon, but his message had come just hours after she returned home. "Come over. I made dinner. No pressure, just company." It was phrased casually, innocently, but they both knew it wasn't just dinner anymore. Something unspoken had been simmering beneath every shared glance, every prolonged silence, every brush of a hand too close to be accidental. She hesitated outside his apartment door, heart pounding. A part of her screamed to walk away, to go home, to be faithful to the life she had built. But another part, louder and aching, reminded her of how long she'd been starving for connection. Marcus opened the door with that same warm smile, but his eyes held a softness that felt far more intimate than any touch. He wore a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms dusted with flour. The scent of garlic and herbs wafted from the kitchen. "You cooked?" she asked, stepping in. "I'm full of surprises," he said, his voice playful. Dinner was simple: pasta, wine, warm bread, but it tasted richer than any meal Sophia had had in years. Not because of the food, but because of the way he looked at her like she mattered. They laughed between bites, talked about books and childhood dreams, and traded stories of quiet heartbreaks. By the time dessert was served, just fresh strawberries and dark chocolate, the tension between them was no longer subtle. Marcus leaned across the table, his voice hushed. "You've been heavy on my mind, Sophia." Her breath caught in her throat. "I don't know what this is, what we're doing." He stood, walking slowly around the table, and stopped beside her chair. "We're not doing anything yet." His fingers grazed her cheek, gentle and uncertain. She didn't move. She couldn't. When he leaned down, his lips brushed hers like a question. She answered without words, pressing into the kiss, as if she had been holding her breath for years. The kiss deepened, slow and exploratory. It wasn't lust-driven, it was yearning, a hunger for something she had been deprived of. Her hands curled around his shirt, pulling him closer, as he trailed kisses along her jaw, her neck, the space behind her ear that hadn't felt warmth in so long. He whispered her name like a prayer, his hands tentative, respectful yet craving. When his fingers slid down her spine, she shivered, not from cold, but from awakening. He led her toward the couch, their bodies moving in quiet synchronicity. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the city lights outside. Their silhouettes tangled in the darkness, faceless, voiceless, yet deeply alive. His lips found her collarbone, her shoulders, her trembling hands. Every movement was slow, deliberate, reverent. It wasn't about urgency, it was about feeling, rediscovering. When he spread her legs, he didn't rush or claim. He kissed her inner thighs like they were sacred ground. And in that moment, it wasn't crude. It was intimate. Healing. He placed his hands over her scars, the ones no one could see, and held her like she was whole, not broken. Sophia's breath quivered beneath his touch. She wasn't just experiencing a physical act. She was being seen, felt, held, loved, in a way she hadn't known she'd missed. And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. They lay in silence, tangled in limbs and emotion, her head resting on his chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear. "I didn't plan for this," she whispered. "Neither did I," he replied softly. The words didn't make it right, but they made it real. Later, as she dressed in silence, guilt crept in like a shadow. Her reflection in the mirror looked the same, but something inside her had shifted permanently. Marcus stood by the door, watching her with unreadable eyes. "Do you regret it?" She hesitated. "I don't know." She left without another word, the city lights blurring through her windshield as she drove home. The streets looked the same. Her house looked the same. Even Daniel, asleep on the couch, looked the same. But nothing was the same anymore. Sophia stood in the doorway, her heart a tangled mess of longing and remorse. And deep inside, she knew she hadn't just crossed a line. She'd stepped into a world she couldn't undo. The morning after lingered like a fog in Sophia's mind, thick, disorienting, and inescapable. She stood at the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, eyes staring through the window but seeing nothing. Her body still remembered Marcus, his touch, his voice, the way he had made her feel as if she mattered again. But now, reality was returning like a slow storm. Daniel walked in, adjusting his tie, his cologne hanging heavy in the air. He offered her a faint smile.
Morning.
Didn't hear you come to bed last night. I couldn't sleep, she replied, avoiding his gaze. Another headache? Something like that. He kissed her forehead absently, an automatic gesture, distant and mechanical. The same kiss he gave her every morning, the one that once meant love. Now it felt like a formality. Sophia watched him walk out the door, briefcase in hand, already immersed in meetings she wasn't a part of. She waited until the front door clicked shut before she let herself exhale. Her chest felt hollow, carved by a guilt she hadn't fully prepared for. But what haunted her more than guilt was how little she regretted it. She hadn't messaged Marcus since leaving his apartment. She couldn't. There were no words that could soften what they'd done or explain what she was feeling. And yet, her fingers hovered over her phone screen more times than she cared to admit. The following days were a blur of contradictions. She functioned, grocery shopping, responding to emails, attending small social events with Daniel, but everything felt like a script she was pretending to know. Her smiles were rehearsed, her laughter hollow. Inside, she was unraveling. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the parts of herself she had buried for years, now suddenly clawing their way back to the surface. One afternoon, while organizing old photo albums in the attic, she found a letter Daniel had written her during their first year of marriage. The ink was slightly faded, but the words hit her like a blow to the chest. I love you in ways I didn't know I could love someone. You make the world feel less heavy. She read it 3 times. Then again. But it felt like reading a message from a stranger, a ghost of a man she once knew, and a version of herself that no longer existed. Later that evening, Daniel surprised her by coming home early. I thought maybe we could have dinner together, he said, placing takeout on the table. Sophia was startled, not by the gesture, but by how unfamiliar it felt. Sure, she replied, forcing a smile. They sat across from each other, the conversation strained but civil. He spoke about work. She nodded and asked the right questions. But between them sat a silence neither dared to touch, a silence that had grown roots and vines, consuming everything in its path. Halfway through the meal, Daniel paused, eyes searching hers. Are we okay, Sophia? The question made her throat tighten. It was the first time he'd acknowledged the distance between them. We're managing, she said quietly. He reached for her hand across the table. I know I've been distant. Work has been consuming everything. But I haven't stopped caring. She stared at his fingers wrapped around hers. They felt warm, familiar, but not enough. I know, she whispered, though she wasn't sure it was true. That night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, Sophia stood by the bedroom window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Her phone buzzed beside her. Marcus. I've been trying not to reach out, but I can't stop thinking about you.
She didn't respond.
Not immediately. But she didn't delete the message either. The next morning, she found herself standing outside the same cafe where it all began. Marcus was already there, seated near the window. When he saw her, something softened in his expression, something that looked like relief or hope. I shouldn't have come, she said as she sat down. But you did, he replied gently. She looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't just an escape. He wasn't a mistake. He was a mirror reflecting everything she had lost and everything she still craved. I don't know what this is, she said, her voice trembling. Maybe it's not about knowing, he replied. Maybe it's just about feeling. Sophia closed her eyes, the weight of her choices pressing on her chest. She had crossed a line. That much was undeniable. But now she had to decide which side she wanted to live on. And the most terrifying part wasn't what she had done. It was realizing how much of herself she had left behind before it even happened.